9 days postpartum, she screamed at me to leave the house I secretly owned. My husband stood behind his mother and let the door close on both of us anyway. 20 minutes later, I made one phone call that undid everything they thought they knew about me. My name is Maren Hale. In 3 weeks, half of Denver would know it by a different name entirely. The snow was already past my ankles when Delphine threw my coat at my feet. She didn't want it touching her porch. I scooped up Asher with one arm. My other hand grabbed the coat, but I couldn't get it zipped. Weston stood in the doorway behind his mother. He didn't move. He didn't speak. 9 days old, and Asher was already learning the world could turn cold without warning. I stood on that driveway in a nursing gown, boots half-laced, holding a baby who trusted me to keep him safe. You are not helpless. They thought I was a broke freelance graphic designer living off Weston's family money. They thought every diaper, every meal, every blanket in that nursery came from cash that wasn't mine. 4 years earlier, I met Weston at a fundraiser in downtown Denver. He was easy to talk to, the kind of easy that makes you stop asking questions. I told him I did some design work. I never told him the work was a 16-person firm with an 11-month client waitlist. Have you ever let someone love you small, just to test whether they'd love you at all? I built that company under a different name, Isla Vance. I created her at 23, terrified no one would take a self-taught woman seriously, working out of a rented studio with a space heater that only worked if you kicked it. Isla got the write-ups. Isla got the waitlist. Maren got thrifted blazers and quiet Sunday dinners where Delphine studied her shoes at the door. My mother raised me alone, cleaning offices at night to keep us afloat. I remembered exactly how certain relatives looked at her second-hand coat. I promised myself young that no one would ever look at me that way twice. I just never planned on hiding the proof from the man I married. Everyone in that family had already decided who I was. None of them had ever bothered to check. That decision was about to cost them everything. They didn't just throw out a woman with a diaper bag. They threw out the one person who could undo every comfortable thing they had left standing. Weston checked his phone 31 times during 9 hours of labor. I counted, because counting was the only thing keeping my mind from splitting apart with the pain. 31 times, his screen lighting his face while a nurse held my hand instead of him. I told myself it was stress. New father nerves. I told myself a lot of things because I'd built our whole marriage on a story I needed to be true. But a marriage built on a story instead of a fact has an expiration date, and ours was closer than I knew. On day 6, Delphine started showing up daily. Soup in one hand, questions in the other, always finding a reason to linger in the kitchen with Weston once I'd gone upstairs to feed Asher. The conversations always stopped the second I came back down the stairs. I told myself it was grandmother enthusiasm. I wanted so badly, so desperately for that to be true, because the alternative meant admitting something in my own house had already started quietly coming apart. On day 8, I found a text on the shared tablet we used for grocery lists. It had synced by accident. Camille to Weston, once she's gone, we won't have to hide this anymore. I read it standing in the nursery at 4 a.m. Asher asleep on my shoulder. My whole body went colder than the room. I confronted Weston the next morning. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He looked almost relieved, like I'd finally said out loud what he'd been too much of a coward to say himself. "This hasn't worked in a long time," he said. "My mother agrees it's better if you figure things out somewhere else." Somewhere else. As if a woman 9 days postpartum kept a spare home in her back pocket. What kind of man plans an exit before his own son can hold up his head? They assumed I didn't have one. That was their first mistake. Delphine arrived that evening with the energy of a woman who'd been waiting years for this exact moment. She swept through the front door like she already owned every square foot of it, which, in fairness to her assumptions, she'd never once considered that anyone but Weston could have paid for. "This arrangement isn't sustainable," she said, settling onto my couch like she'd paid for it herself. Some viewers will say I should have told the truth the day I met Weston, but a woman doesn't owe her worth as a receipt to a man who claims to love her first. "You'll figure something out," Delphine said, smiling the kind of smile that isn't kind at all. "Working out of that little studio of yours, you always do." The way she said little made something in my chest go tight and cold, colder than the window she was sitting next to. I asked her, calmly, where exactly she expected a woman with 2 locked-out hands and 1 newborn to go at 9 at night in a snowstorm, with no family in this state and no income she was willing to acknowledge existed. She didn't answer me at all. She just kept quietly packing my hospital bag by the door. She'd already decided. What she hadn't decided was who I actually was underneath the version of me she'd spent 4 years managing. By 9 o'clock, the voices below had turned sharp enough to carry through the floorboards. When I came downstairs with Asher finally asleep against my chest, Delphine was standing by the door holding my coat, my hospital bag, and a stack of onesies. "I think it's best you go stay somewhere tonight," she said. I told her I wasn't leaving my home at 9 at night with a 9-day-old baby in a blizzard. That's the exact moment a home stops being a home and starts being a battlefield. That's when her voice cracked into the scream that started this whole story. "Take your baby and get out." I looked at Weston. I actually waited for him to move, some small foolish part of me still hoping he'd choose his son over his mother's temper. He didn't move. He opened the door himself. The single most unresolved question left standing on that porch followed me straight into the snow. If the man who promised to protect us could stay silent through this, what exactly had 4 years of my own silence been protecting? I stood in that driveway for exactly 11 seconds before I moved again, and everything that happened after those 11 seconds is the part Delphine and Weston never saw coming. The wind found every gap in my coat like it had personal business with my bones. Asher's cry rose into something raw and frantic. I pressed my lips to the top of his head and whispered the only 4 words I had left. "We're okay. We're okay." My body was still recovering from labor. Every stitch inside me screamed at the effort of standing upright, and the cold cut through cotton like it wanted something from me personally. For a few seconds I genuinely couldn't move. Not from fear. From the simple physics of a body that had given birth 9 days earlier being asked to stand in 20-degree wind. I looked back once at the porch light glowing gold against the snow, at Weston's shadow retreating from the window. Something in me went still, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. They thought this was the end of something for me. They had no idea it was the opening move.
I want you to understand something before what happened next. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. What would you do in the first 60 phone call itself? What would you do in the first 60 seconds after the 2 people who were supposed to protect you chose each other instead? I didn't call a shelter. I didn't call a friend to come rescue me sobbing on their porch. I did the one thing 4 years of underestimating me had guaranteed neither of them would ever expect. I pulled out my phone and called my company's emergency car line. I pulled out my Furge, the one my firm keeps on standby for exactly this kind of night. 11 minutes. That's how long it took. 11 minutes later, headlights cut through the snow. A black SUV pulled into the driveway of the house I still legally half owned, and a driver stepped out holding a blanket already warmed for a newborn. Delphine watched from the window. I watched her face change in real time. The exact second broke freelance designer stopped making sense to her. She'd spent 4 years deciding stopped making sense to her. She never spent 4 imagined I already had a driver on the way before she'd finished slamming the door. I was never broke. I had simply spent 4 years choosing not to be loved for my bank balance instead of my face. By midnight, wrapped in a hotel robe with Asher, finally asleep in a warmed bassinet, I opened my laptop and did the one thing I had avoided for 4 years. I told the truth. Short. Still. Quiet. My lawyer Renata Cho picked up on the second ring. I gave her everything. The house, the down payment records under my real name, the affair, the scream in the snow. She listened without a single interruption. Then she said the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. Marin, you hold 68% equity in that house through documented transfers. You have 4 years of bank statements showing income Western never kare. And you have a text message admitting to a planned affair timed around the birth of your son. This isn't complicated, Renata said. This isn't complicated, Renata said. This is going to be clean. My next call went to Naomi Bright, my PR director, who'd spent 2 years asking permission to tell the design world that Isla Vance and Marin Hale were the same woman. That night, for the first time, I told her to run it. Not out of spite. I did it because hiding my success had never protected my marriage. It had only protected two people's ability to underestimate me. And underestimation is a dangerous thing to hand people who already think poorly of you.
Within a week, Naomi's team ran a routine conflict check on every active client contract, the same review any firm my size runs when a founder's name goes public. That's how we found it. Delphine's business manager had signed with my firm 11 months earlier through a referral neither of us had ever traced back to family. Nobody had connected the names. Until now, they didn't need to. They saw a woman with nothing. They forgot to check. Renata moved fast. 3 days later, a judge granted me exclusive use of the house, not a final ruling, just enough shelter to get Asher and me through the weeks ahead. 7 weeks of filings followed. One deposition where Renata read Weston's own words from that night back to him, slowly, twice, and let the silence do what no argument could. His lawyer tried to argue the house was marital property anyway. Renata answered with 4 years of wire transfers and a paper trail that traced his declining contributions straight to an apartment leased under Camille's name. The temporary order held. Then it became permanent. The affair that had once been implied now sat inside the public case record, whether anyone wanted it there or not. Delphine didn't apologize. She never softened. Instead, she told anyone who'd listen that I'd manipulated my way into their family. She miscalculated, because the story circulating wasn't about a con artist anymore. It was about a mother pushed into snow with a 9-day-old baby. Design clients, it turns out, care deeply about the character of the woman renovating their million-dollar homes. 2 of Delphine's boutiquins, the ones she'd spent a decade keeping barely solvent, had signed renovation contracts with my firm the year before, through that same untraced referral. My legal team exercised the standard morality clause the week the affair became public record. The contracts were terminated. The exact financial lifeline Delphine had been counting on disappeared in a single phone call I never had to make personally. Consequence doesn't need to be loud to be complete. Losing the inn contracts wasn't what actually broke Delphine. What really finished this story took months longer to arrive, and it didn't come from a courtroom at all. Some people will say going public was cruel. I'd ask them what they'd call locking a 9-day-old and his mother out of a house in a blizzard. I won't pretend this cost me nothing. Some of Weston's family called me calculating for going public at all. A few clients quietly stepped back, uneasy about the publicity attached to my name. Legal fees touched savings I'd built for years without ever having to. There were nights I sat awake with Asher against my chest and felt nothing like a woman winning anything at all. Just a woman surviving one more exhausting hour of a fight she never asked to start. Custody settled with me as primary caregiver. Weston's visitation started supervised, then loosened as he completed the court's required classes over the following months. I didn't get a clean, cinematic ending. I got a real one, which is a different and harder thing to hold, and co-parenting with a man who broke your family apart doesn't stop being exhausting just because the paperwork finally closes. I moved back into the house that spring, the same driveway edged now with the season's first crocuses pushing up through the last of the snow. I stood there with Asher on my hip and finally let myself cry. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. Weston reached out months later. He wrote that he never expected things to go this far, that he hadn't realized how much he'd taken for granted. I answered with 4 words that felt truer than anything I could have shouted at him on that porch. You had every warning. He asked me once, in a parking lot outside my own office, why I never told him the truth about who I was from the beginning. He looked smaller standing there than I remembered him ever being. What would you have said to the man who decided a smaller version of you was easier to love? I told him exactly who I was, I said. You just decided a woman without much money was easier to keep. That was never my secret to carry. That one was always his, and he still doesn't have an answer for it. These days, my studio has grown into a full office on the other side of that house, walls covered in blueprints, a toddler learning to walk between drafting tables while my assistant tries to keep him out of the fabric samples. Some evenings, once Asher is finally bathed and settled into heavy, boneless sleep, I sit alone in that studio and just breathe. The quiet in that house now is a different quiet than the one I used to shrink myself inside of. If someone's already decided you have nothing left to lose, prove them wrong. Sit with that for a second. If this story reminded you why underestimating a quiet woman is always a mistake, hit like before you go. It helps this exact kind of story find the next woman who needs to hear it. Subscribe to When Family Revenge Strikes, because the next driveway story might be closer to yours than you think. They handed me a snowstorm and called it an ending. I turned it into the night everything I'd built finally came home to me.